Annie Dillard said, "We are never more deeply asleep at the switch as when we fancy we control any switches at all." In a 2004 Berry Street essay, the Reverend Barbara Merritt, first Unitarian Worcester, am I saying that correctly? Worcester? Worcester. Worcester. It's up in Cape Cod area, right? Well, that's where Cape Cod is. Yes. And Reverend Barbara Merritt was from First Unitarian in Worcester. And in that 2004 Berry Street essay, she spoke to the annual gathering of Unitarian Universalist ministers on the subject of taking refuge. She said, "No matter what we say from the pulpit, we are only offering words to a world full of suffering. We can only bring our own finite compassion, limited understandings, and narrow experience to the challenges of existence." And then she asked her colleagues, "Does being a religious leader work for you? When you imagine religious leadership, what role does grace play? What is it that you control?" The Christian tradition, Reverend Merritt reminded us, is often eloquent about the refuge that a merciful and infinitely loving God offers to struggling souls. The parable of the prodigal son is a classic story of an independent and arrogant young man finally needing to take refuge with a compassionate and forgiving father. Few, if any, who set out on ambitious adventures meet with unqualified success. The Prodigal Son is a story for all of us who find that we have wasted our resources and have lost our way. End quote. In 1996, I began to date Kathy, the person who would 3 years later become my wife. Kathy had 3 children. Michelle, the oldest daughter, was now a young adult. John Matthew was 15 years old, and Lauren was 7. I knew Michelle and John because Kathy and I had lived together 10 years earlier. And I cared for those children in the home while Kathy worked the night shift as a nurse. Michelle at that time, when I moved in, was 7 years old. John Matthew, 2. John and I got along royally. Michelle was rambunctious and easy to love, but harder to contain. Kathy and I eventually separated and lost touch. When we reunited 10 years later, she had given birth to Lauren. John was 15, still at home. Michelle was 21 and living independently. Kathy had a wonderful relationship with all her children, and I came to love them as I would my own, at least the best that I knew how. Then something unexpected and mysterious occurred. After about a year of being together, Michelle suddenly disappeared from our lives. She just stopped calling her mother, her number disconnected, whereabouts unknown. Kathy was, of course, distraught. Michelle had been a part of our lives with no sign of discontent or difficulty. The absence was an emotional blow, especially, of course, to her own mother. Michelle was a happy, considerate young adult with many friends, an easygoing party type. This mysterious absence went on for about 2 years. It took a toll emotionally, but we muddled on. I was a UU minister by then, commuting to Valdosta twice a month. Kathy and I became engaged and planned our wedding for June 16 of 1999. Then a remarkable thing took place. Kathy, as I recall, had made an appointment for a manicure at a hairstylist. She sat in the waiting room and looked around, and there sat Michelle. Kathy almost didn't recognize her daughter for the changes, but she knew. She felt it in her soul, and the biggest reunion of her life began. Just months before her wedding, and Michelle was back in our lives in time for the big event. Not only that, but she had given birth to a son in her time away. Kathy was a first-time grandmother. Michelle began to go to Buckland Bridge UU Church with us, attend our backyard wedding, and bring the family so much joy and laughter again. This past Tuesday night, I sat with my gang of friends at a rental home in Volano Beach in St. Augustine and listened to Keith's brother Paul, one of my best friends, play the Rolling Stones song that you heard, Prodigal Son. I knew then that would be my topic this morning, and I knew the story of Michelle would be part of it. She was not a prodigal daughter by any means. Her disappearance was not about being profligate or recklessly extravagant, but it was about her bruising the bond between mother and child. And it was about the unbreakable nature of that bond and the joy of reuniting and the trembling awareness of our helplessness when life assails us. As the Reverend Merritt said in that Berry Street essay, helplessness is not hopelessness. James Luther Adams, the preeminent UU theologian and seminary professor of our time, said the parable of the prodigal son is not primarily an ethical parable teaching right behavior. And contrary to our story for all ages, I have to take issue, the story is not about forgiveness either. It is, said James Luther Adams, a metaphysical parable, a picture of the social cosmos of divinely given community, of the divinely given human freedom, and of the divinely given task to fulfill that freedom in all its venture and risk. In short, said Adams, this is a parable of the nature of existence and meaning, and of the love of God, of God's love for humanity, and of the human response to that love. And let me say right away that you do not have to believe in God in order to believe in the love of God. All you have to do is experience a sense of meaning or purpose in life. Experience the grace of knowing, as Annie Dillard suggested, that you are not in control and that something in life is sacred and worthy of your devotion. As Professor Adams said, participation in community is our response to the love of God. Reverend Barbara Merritt said to those ministers in Long Beach, California, at that gathering of our spiritual leaders, that, quote, admitting to the universal experience of powerlessness has almost become a heresy to Unitarian Universalists. We celebrate empowerment and creativity and a mission of going forward through the ages, in the words of that old Unitarian hymn. And it's in our book, number 114, if you want to check it out. Forward through the ages, in unbroken line, move the faithful spirits at the call divine. Gifts in differing measure, hearts of one accord, manifold the service, one the sure reward. To the tune of Onward Christian Soldiers, it was a social gospel hymn written in 1908 for the installation of a minister for the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley, California, expressing, quote, optimistic hope for an ever-evolving humanity. It was the marching song of liberal Protestantism, as the Reverend Carlton Young called it. Onward and upward forever. We don't know the meaning of the word powerlessness. But Barbara Merritt asks, what are we to do when we are overwhelmed by grief or confronted with professional failure? What are we to do when we can't control our own health, our own mental state, or even our own children? Reality has all kinds of lessons of powerlessness to teach religious liberals. The story of Michelle, tragically, did not end with her triumphant family reunion. Just 3 months after our wedding, Michelle was killed in an automobile collision. It rocked us to the core. I'm not sure we could have survived at all without the love and support of our church community. But it changed us all forever in ways that we might never even understand. Barbara Merritt said to those ministers, most of us will know that terrible experience of standing in the pulpit or at a hospital bedside, feeling utterly inadequate for the task of addressing tragedy, conflict, and the limitations of human understanding. And still, we must act. And so I put the questions to you that she asked of us. Does your faith work as a spiritual practice? Does it satisfy your deepest hungers or bring you peace? Does it bring you closer to contentment? Is your spiritual practice taking you where your heart and mind and soul want to go? In all world religions, Reverend Merritt said, and in every mystical tradition, there is a balance, an equilibrium between effort and grace. A tension between our responsibility to take action and our knowledge that we can never go it alone. The love of God, as James Luther Adams expressed it, the love of the Father in our parable, the message of the prodigal son, is that we are bound by duty, but saved by grace. The younger son shows us that human frailty, suffering, and despair can lead us to, quote, come to our senses and start again. Helplessness is not hopelessness. The elder son shows us that we do not achieve that grace by our own hands. He stands outside in anger and rebuke. As Professor Adams says, he makes his ethical principles sacred and sovereign, but they turn out to be unreliable because they would make the community exclusive. They left no room to greet that prodigal who has come to himself and wants to be a part of the community again. And the Father says it all. It's the promise of our liberal and inclusive faith. You never had to earn my love, he says to that elder son. You have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But this brother of yours was dead, and now he lives. He was lost and has been found. Sister made it home in time for the wedding. We had to be merry and rejoice. So may it ever be. Amen.